Attention! This makes absolutely no sense. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Zander's Facts.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome into the latest edition of the Zander's Facts podcast. I am, of course, the aforementioned Zander. It is Wednesday, July 12th, 2023. It's episode 111 of the podcast. Y'all, thank you all so much for listening. We got a lot of facts to get to this week because we have got a returning guest being brought back to the podcast. It is Dr. Bobby, who is basically our expert on Russia and Ukraine and the conflict that's going on between them right now. As you may know, there's a war going on over there. And you know what? Dr. Bobby actually went, just recently, traveled over to Europe, not to Ukraine or Russia, but pretty close. So he's got some information to share with us. Also, basically, all the facts you need on everything that's going on with the war over in Russia and Ukraine, which is pretty important to us, even here in America, even across a continent and an ocean away. What's going on over there is still pretty important to the US. So we talk about everything you need to know, basically give an update on what's going on in Ukraine. That is this week on the Zander's Facts podcast. Of course, I did say that this episode is coming out on Wednesday, July 12th, which, not to brag, but it is the first Zander's Facts podcast that is coming out on a very special day, July 12th, Zander's birthday. Just thought I'd let you all know because
Congratulations.
Dr. Bobby does bring it up, but it is Zander's birthday today, the day this podcast comes out, which means it is an extra special podcast this week. We're going to get to it in just a second, but before we do, just thought I'd remind you all that if you like the Zander's Facts podcast, if you think you're going to like all the facts on this week's edition, remember to follow this podcast, download this episode 111, rate and review the podcast, then check us out on all the socials, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, at Zander's Facts. That is Zander with a Z. And most importantly, remember to tell all your friends, spread the facts. Zander's Facts Podcast. Tell all your friends about the podcast, about the newsletter. Zander's Weekend Facts. If you didn't know, we have a weekly newsletter that comes out every Sunday morning. It's got a recap of the week's top headlines so you never miss a fact. It is free to sign up and get it in your email every Sunday morning. Just go to the link in this episode's description. And you should also check out the Zander's Facts link tree because it has all the Zander's Facts links that you need. And just in case you missed some of our past episodes, you should probably go listen to those because we do some new facts every week. Usually, every single episode is a little bit different. So last week, of course, we did not talk about Russia and Ukraine. We talked about college conference realignment, college football, the summer news. It just trickles every single summer. The third year in a row we've had to do that podcast, so we did it again. We also, of course, talked about the indictment of former President Donald Trump, everything you need to know. We had a couple instant reactions to the U.S. men's national team playing Mexico and Canada in the Nations League. And of course, they're playing in the Gold Cup now. Y'all, the CONCACAF Gold Cup, if you don't know. Sunday, they barely beat Canada on penalties. Ugh. We're not talking soccer this week because next week is our Women's World Cup preview, if you didn't know. So you're going to want to tune in next week because we're also going to talk a little bit men's soccer, but we're also going to preview the Women's World Cup and find out if the U.S. is going to win their third straight World Cup. Never been done before, men's or women's. Our U.S. women could be the first to do that. I mean, I don't know. But if you've missed any of our past episodes, you should go do that wherever you find your podcast. So let's get to this week's big facts. That would be talking about the Russia-Ukraine war with our Zander's Facts Russia-Ukraine expert, Dr. Bobby. That is next as the Zander's Facts podcast continues.
Zander's Facts.
Y'all, we haven't had this guest on the podcast in a while. I looked back, actually. It was episode 79 from last year. We're on episode 111 this week, and we are talking about the war that is going on in Russia and Ukraine. You've probably heard about it, but there's a lot you probably haven't heard about. And that's why we're bringing on our guest this week. It is Dr. Bobby. He is a Russian professor at Virginia Tech. Dr. Bobby, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me, Zander. And big thanks for having me on the special Zander's birthday edition of Zander's Facts, or Zander's birthday. In case he hasn't announced it, today is Zander's birthday. Well,
the day the podcast comes out.
Yeah.
Yes. That's right. It's the first time that the podcast comes out on my birthday. July 12th, best day of the year.
Are you sure?
I mean, how about that? But beyond all of our celebrations, we do have some stuff to get to. We are talking, of course, about Russia and Ukraine, the war that's been going on. You probably have heard about some of the stuff that's been going on. There was like this mini rebellion that was going on. NATO, Sweden might be about to join NATO because Turkey said, you know what? We'll let you in. That's fine. And Dr. Bobby himself has actually been traveling a little bit. So he has some insight to give us that we can't get here in America, even though he's back in America now. But we're going to get to all of that here on this podcast with Dr. Bobby. But the first thing I wanted to get to is that rebellion that happened with the Wagner Group and Prigozhin. First, we heard about this on the news. It was breaking news. Everybody was talking about it. But what exactly happened there with this kind of rebellion where for a little bit we thought, oh my gosh, is Putin in trouble? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, he was, apparently. And it seems likely he's in a little bit more trouble, was in a little bit more trouble, and in fact is certainly more trouble than the Kremlin is letting on, at least. It actually, you can't quite give a whole history of the Wagner Group here. This would take a couple of podcasts, but this was the force that really has demonstrated itself to be the only effective force in Ukraine fighting for the Russians right now, because the Ministry of Defense forces have been nothing if not incompetent.
Whoops.
But this is the force that took Bakhmut at the cost of about 20,000 people, from what it looks like. Incidentally, if you are looking closely at the war right now, you know that Bakhmut is about to be lost. The Ukrainians now have the high ground around it, and it's looking more and more like the Russians are going to have to abandon it. They're going after the ground lines of communications there. And I don't think anybody is guaranteeing that it's going to fall within the next couple of days, but the signs are looking really bad for Russia in there right now.
So where is that in Ukraine?
Bakhmut, it is, if you look towards where the current areas of Russian occupation, this is going to be in the northwest of that little strip. So obviously it's in far eastern Ukraine, but it's a little bit in the northern strip of where the Russians currently have control. But in any case, this is the force that took Bakhmut and essentially leveled the city. And after they did so, there was an ongoing dispute about supplies, about munitions that Prigozhin, who is the leader of the Wagner Group and who led this mutiny, was directing at the Ministry of Defense. Wagner has been dependent on the Ministry of Defense for supplies, munitions, and things like that. And he called out the heads of essentially the Russian military by name, and sometimes very colorful names. Russian is especially fertile soil for beautiful and creative obscenity.
Words we can't use on this podcast.
Yeah.
If you say so.
He was pretty free in describing Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Gerasimov, who was the Russian chief of the general staff, basically the guy in charge of the forces. Calling them out directly. He had actually been doing this for quite a while. So after Bakhmut is taken, tenuously, the division between the Ministry of Defense and Wagner just grows sharper. And at one point, Prigozhin actually accuses the Ministry of Defense of attacking Wagner forces. So at one point, Wagner captures a Russian colonel. And to all appearances, they beat him. They make him give this hostage video confession, and he's got a big ass black eye, and he goes on there and describes what he did. So eventually the Wagner forces withdraw safely, and the Ministry of Defense takes over Bakhmut. Essentially, at this point, they're just defending it. They get to the sort of relative safety of southern Russia, where they claim they were again attacked by the Ministry of Defense. This time with, I think it was helicopters. It was some kind of air assault, and this was what Prigozhin at least cited as a central provocation for the mitiage, the mutiny. And this is how it's being described in Russian, is that this was a mutiny, not quite a revolt or a rebellion, but they were really moving against the Ministry of Defense and not necessarily against Putin, which is where things really get kind of weird. But anyway, as this begins, they essentially take the entirety of Rostov-on-Don, and then they begin this march for liberation, or whatever it was they called it, towards Moscow. They go through Voronezh. There's further attacks, and it costs, I think, about 8 or so Russian Ministry of Defense lives. And in fact, these were pilots, and these are not people that the Ministry of Defense can afford to lose. And it actually kind of seemed like there was nothing that was really going to be able to stop the column until it got to Moscow. Now, how this happened, this would have been a really gory mess for everybody involved. Most likely it wouldn't have been successful, but given the incompetence of the Russian military so far, it's not out of the question that Wagner could have, really done a lot of damage. So this is kind of the background, I guess, and sort of what happened. After that, everything becomes just incredibly obscure.
Yeah, we heard about the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, basically brokering this deal as Prigozhin and his men were marching presumably to Moscow. But we hear about the president of Belarus brokering this deal to have them stop and have Prigozhin actually reside in Belarus. What do we know about that? Because Belarus is obviously one of the few allies that Russia has in all of this.
Well, with every passing day, what Lukashenko has said becomes less plausible. Yeah, I mean, Prigozhin apparently, well, now he's almost undoubtedly not in Belarus, as Lukashenko says. In fact, it's unclear where he is, but he's got to be in Russia somewhere. What's really gotten weird about this is that, he met with Putin on June 29th. And the headlines for this, of course, is that Putin meets with Prigozhin after the mutiny. And this is also after Putin vows swift, bloody revenge on all the mutineers. Mm-hmm. And it kind of gives you an idea of how difficult Putin finds his position right now. Again, this was really the only effective fighting force in Ukraine, and pretty much anywhere else for that matter, as far as, the Russian military goes. This meeting was not just with Prigozhin. This was also with 35 of his commanders. And it wasn't just like a meet and greet, like, hey, okay, we're loyal to you now, which is apparently what the minister or the Kremlin's press office is saying about this, is that, they swore loyalty to Putin and this kind of thing. They actually met for about 3 hours. And it's really interesting to just sort of speculate on what could have been going back and forth in this, given Prigozhin's sort of weird honesty sometimes, particularly the fact that he declared the truth about the invasion, that this, Ukraine was no threat to Russia. This whole thing is just a farce. That he would, get to talk with Putin for 3 hours about this, and, that the Kremlin would trumpet this as, a sign of loyalty is really weird. So anyway, where Prigozhin is now, is really just kind of a mystery. I mean, apparently Wagner has been offered further employment opportunities, not necessarily as Wagner, but, the various commanders and soldiers have been. There was even a televised raid, and some of you might have seen this, on Prigozhin's possessions in St. Petersburg, where, the Russian media has just been totally trashing it. So everything seems confused. Everything is murky. And, in short, it would just be really silly to take anything at face value that comes out of the Russian government. Yeah, I have no idea. I don't think anybody does. And certainly nobody in Russia does.
Yeah. So, I mean, this all really leads to where does Vladimir Putin stand right now? Because this rebellion against him obviously happened, and, who knows what's going on right with Wagner right now. But also, there was that report or whatever of the drones, the drone attack on the Kremlin, which Russia says was Ukraine. Was it? Was it not? I don't know if we know.
I think it probably was.
Okay. So
it wasn't an attack, but I do think Ukraine was likely behind that.
And then the last time we spoke, I was looking back on our notes and we were talking about Russia was calling up 300,000 basically civilians to come join the army, and that led to a bunch of people trying to flee the country. So where does Vladimir Putin stand right now in his own country? Is his power, is his support diminishing at all?
Yeah, it's probably pretty interesting you brought up that mobilization, because that is what he needs to do to fight this war. I'm not saying win this war, but to fight this war. And politically, he can't do it, particularly after this mutiny. Is Putin still in charge? Yeah. But is his power and support diminished? Yes, also. But I mean, the war has been a catastrophic mistake from pretty much any angle. But from the personal Putin angle, it's really been a big one. It really is kind of difficult to peer really closely in there and see just how much support he may have lost. But it seems to have been considerable.
Well, could we find the next Russian elections are March 2024, which is less than a year away? Could we find anything out about that, or are the elections in Russia just all, it's not really free and fair?
Nice try, buddy.
Yeah, there was a great old Soviet joke. It was sort of like a weird riddle. When were the first Soviet elections held? When God put Eve before Adam and said, choose a wife. And it's really been kind of the same thing ever since. It's not just a Soviet joke. It's been the same thing with Putin. If Putin runs, it's obvious who's going to win. It's not really even going to be a contest. The question, of course, could be, is he going to run? March 24, it's a little ways away. Who knows what's going to happen before then? I mean, I wouldn't want to predict it, but if I had to, I would go with Vladimir Vladimirovich.
What does that mean?
Putin.
Duh.
So, turning our attention now over from what's actually going on in Russia to the West, obviously Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine partly because he wanted to, or he thought that the West was divided enough that they wouldn't really help Ukraine and fight back. That obviously has not gone Putin's way, and now Finland has since joined NATO since the war began. And a couple days ago, Turkey, who was one of two, I believe, holdouts in NATO for Sweden to join, just said that they're going to support Sweden. Hungary's the other one, and you would think Hungary's probably just going to say, all right, well, you can come. So Sweden is, not that big of a power, not that big of a country. You wouldn't think a big of a threat to Russia, but what effect does that have with Russia, basically, what we just talked about, looking like they're in shambles, and NATO keeps expanding?
Yeah, Sweden, well, it might not look like that much, but Sweden, along with Turkey, is one of the traditional Russian enemies. The 17th century, 18th century, they fought a lot of wars against Sweden.
Fight me.
In a way, this is kind of how Peter the Great got to be the Great. During the 18th century, there were a number of wars against Turkey too. It's significant in the way that this just sort of adds to what Putin was trying to prevent, and this is another NATO country right next to his border. It's exactly what he did not want to have. Is it going to have an effect on this war? Probably not. But every little bit helps, and you have a country that is throwing full-throated support behind Ukraine. It definitely doesn't hurt.
Yeah, we got more to talk about with NATO in a minute because they're meeting right now in Lithuania. They're having their big summit, so we got to talk about that as well. But another thing that came up in the news regarding our country, the United States, was that in the new aid package that's being sent to Ukraine, that includes what we know as cluster bombs, and which I wrote about on Zander's Weekend Facts are controversial because they're basically these bombs that Russia's been using in the war that have dozens, hundreds of these droplets, but some of them don't explode immediately, and they can stay there for years, which can obviously, be bad after the war is over. So, I mean, I guess I'm going to ask you why these are so controversial, because there was the Biden White House obviously supports it, but then I saw on CNN or something that one of the top Democrats in Congress is like, I don't support this. And then you had a Republican in Congress who went on there and was like, I support this. So what does that really mean that the U.S. is sending these bombs to Ukraine? Obviously, it means they're sending aid to Ukraine, which is good for them and what they want. But why are these so controversial?
Well, the weapon itself is, the real controversy is due to the fact that they had this extremely widespread beyond their initial zone of impact, combined with that high failure rate of the individual bomblets. And I think it can get as high as 40%.
It's a fact.
40% of these bombs don't explode on impact and can be dangerous for years or even decades afterwards. The cluster bombs that the United States used in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War were still killing people in the first decade of the 2000s. So, these things are awful. They come out as these like shiny little metal things that any kid that finds is immediately going to start playing with, and start, pick it up, start throwing it around and that kind of thing. So, I mean, you can see how awful they would be for the civilian population. A little kid, a farmer, really anybody who runs into it can get a limb blown off or worse. The U.S. definitely ran into a lot of issues with these in Iraq, too. There were some pretty credible accusations of, civilians being killed by these a lot. And this is one of the reasons that so many nations, but not the United States and Russia, have banned their use. It really is a vile and destructive weapon. Then again, any weapon in a war is atrocious. I mean, the risk to civilians here is significant. And I think there rightly are a lot of objections to using these. But this is not going to be the introduction of cluster munitions into the conflict. And as a matter of fact, Ukraine was accused of using these as far back as 2014 in Donbass. So it's actually something they've been asking for. And Russia, of course, has zero regard whatsoever to the weapons they use. And it's been employing them for decades in Georgia, Chechnya, Afghanistan. And in Ukraine, they've actually been deliberately used on population centers. This happened in Kharkiv early in the war. I mean, there was another place where one of them hit a kindergarten. So it's awful, but it's not really anything new. Like I said, Ukraine has been specifically asking for them. The U.S. is kind of justifying it in this way, saying that it's going to be the Ukrainians using them on Ukrainian territory. And it is reasonable to assume that for this reason, they're going to keep a pretty careful eye on where they're being used. So they will know how to do some kind of cleanup after this is over. The Pentagon also claims that there's a very low failure rate with the bomblets on impact. I can't really evaluate that. I don't know how reliable that claim is or not, but even a single dud found by a kid or a farmer is, it's one too many. But relatively speaking, in the overall scheme of this conflict, it's really hard to accuse the U.S. or the Ukrainians of heinous disregard for human life, particularly seeing what they're up against.
I guess I'm just confused why Ukraine is specifically asking for them. Is it just because they're like, well, Russia did it first, we don't care, or?
No, I mean, for one thing, everybody's getting low on artillery. And, you can shoot these. They don't necessarily have to be missiles. There's a couple of ways you can deliver these. And, they can obviously be very effective against concentrated Russian forces, which the Ukrainians seem to have a knack for finding.
Okay. In the broader scheme of things, when you're talking about aid, is Ukraine, are they getting the aid that they want or that they really need from the West and from the US? Obviously, they're getting some, and that's allowed them to stay in this war and actually make advances against the Russian occupied territories in Ukraine. What is the sense really?
Well, whenever you've got this much of your country occupied by, a criminal invader, you're not getting enough. Are they grateful for what they're getting and all that? Yes, very much so. But they very much do need more. It's especially now with this counteroffensive, it would be good to have the air support that they could have from the F-16s. What they're facing as far as the dug-in Russian defenses is formidable to say the least. I mean, the Russians have been a completely incompetent attacking force, but playing defense is much easier. And, in some places, their defenses, are, around like 35 kilometers thick. They have tank traps, barbed wire, all kinds of minefields, which, in this instance is going to be much more brutal than any cluster bombs are going to be. It's really going to be difficult to get through this. And having the air support that you could get from the F-16s would be a huge advantage to the Ukrainians trying to do this attack. And they don't have it. And they're not really going to get it in time.
Mm-hmm. I guess what I'm asking is obviously this past year in the US, we've had a divided Congress, some of whom in especially the House, who have been very vocal on their opposition to giving a lot of money to Ukraine when we have issues in the US they say we need to deal with first. So has that really had an effect, or has it just been continuous for the US? Has there been a noticeable drop-off at all to Ukraine?
No, I don't think so at all. Okay. In fact, I think it seems to have been getting progressively better. There were a lot of weapons that were just sort of like off limits at the beginning. And even the F-16s that I was just talking about, they're now on the table, and other countries are going to be providing them. It'll be coming late, but at least they're getting them. Another one, though, which I don't think, well, at least last I checked, is not completely off the table, but we're not giving them, which would have a huge impact on the war, would be the ATACMS, the missiles, essentially. They're, a little bit like the Storm Shadows. But if the Ukrainians had this, they could essentially hit Crimea. There's nowhere in their country that they could not hit with these. They could hit Crimea, which would completely dislodge the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which would create a huge problem for the Russians trying to strike the civilian centers with some of their cruise missiles. Once that happened, this war could end really quickly. The Russian army is just not motivated for it. And if Ukraine is really hitting Crimea, it would be that much more devastating. So I think the idea may still play out, but one of the restrictions may be that the U.S. itself just does not have enough of these. The thing is, though, for the relative low cost, you could make the entire Russian war effort unfeasible. The Ukrainians could hit them anywhere in the country. And as they've already shown with some less effective weapons like the HIMARS, they know what to look for and they know where and when to strike. And this has had a devastating effect on the Russian military as far as numbers. It would have a devastating effect on Russian morale. But, to be honest, the way this war is going, even if the Ukrainians were not getting anything and everything they needed, I don't think it would affect the morale. Until the Russians are gone, they're going to keep fighting.
Mm-hmm. So now I wanted to ask you about your recent travels, as I kind of alluded to at the top. Dr. Bobby, if you all haven't know, was recently in the Baltic countries of Latvia and Lithuania.
Wow!
Yes. So, and those are obviously NATO countries. Latvia borders Russia and Belarus. Lithuania has a border with Belarus. And also Russia, that Russian enclave they have.
Kaliningrad.
What is kind of the feeling there, right? You're talking about almost at the front lines. We're over here in the US. We're Europe and the Atlantic Ocean away. but they're right there. We're talking about former territories of the Soviet Union, too. What are their feelings right now on the war and how it's going?
Oh, well, the official line is hardcore pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia. Give them everything they need. We need to stop this now. Russia has to be soundly defeated. They've got to go, which is completely understandable. Even a passing glance at the history of the 20th century, the 19th century, even earlier than that, will tell you exactly why. They know what a big threat this is. Yeah, but that said, it's a little bit different on the ground, and it really depends who you talk to in some places. Riga, for instance, the capital of Latvia. When I got there, I will usually speak Russian in Riga. You can get around with it very easily. But this year I didn't know what to expect. I was pretty reluctant to do it at first. And I was speaking English in places where, in past years I'd been speaking Russian. But as it turned out, it was kind of okay. You could still speak Russian there without people, giving you the evil eye. There are a lot of Russian expatriates there. A lot of Russian media is still being run out of Riga. So it's not like Russians are being completely rejected because of their ethnicity or anything like that. The Latvian government, of course, is very much supportive, and most of the Latvians themselves are. When you get a little bit further east in Latvia, closer to the Russian border, particularly in Daugavpils, where it's a much higher Russian population, things change, but not to a shocking degree. There are a lot of people who do support Russia in this, which seems absolutely shocking, but they do. A lot of them are ethnic Russians. A lot of the ethnic Russians, of course, do not. But it's kind of odd too. Talking to some people out there, it's almost like they're looking for an excuse. I talked to one person right before I left, actually, and I was asking, what people here think of the war and that kind of thing. And he told me about how people from Ukraine would come in, go to a cafe, order food, and not pay for it.
Huh.
Which wasn't exactly relevant to what I was asking about. But whatever, I'm not a journalist. It was just a conversation. But it's not unusual for people of different Soviet republics to think people in the other republics suck. And that's kind of, what they were thinking with this. Now, this was an older person. He was obviously formed in the Soviet Union. Maybe that's got something to do with it. But there is, in some cases, there is this sort of like weird prejudice. Yes. Lithuania, however, to all appearances, is much different. There does not seem to be, I wouldn't say it's unanimous, but it's pretty close to it. Yeah, in Vilnius and even in Kaunas, you see as many Ukrainian flags as you do Lithuanian flags. There is full-throated support behind this. Now, part of this, of course, was due to the fact that the NATO conference was coming up at the time.
And it's happening right now.
Yeah. But, the support that Lithuania especially has been throwing behind Ukraine, it was not just something being done up. Yeah, you'll see Ukrainian flags everywhere. There are still people who speak Russian, but I was never really that happy speaking Russian in Lithuania. I did it a few times this year without any problems. One really interesting little anecdote. We went to the Museum of Illusion in Vilnius, and on the door was a sign. It's usually, I think it was like 11 euros to get in. Basically, citizens of Ukraine admitted free.
Get that dough.
And this wasn't something that was totally unusual out there. There were a number of little things like that, in addition to all the flags and things like that around. The presidential palace actually had some of the columns decorated in Ukrainian colors. So, officially and pretty much on the street, there's a lot of support, behind Ukraine.
Story time!
Yeah, so obviously the NATO summit, which is happening right now, the 11th and the 12th of July, is happening in Vilnius in Lithuania. And I was just reading about this here. The president of Lithuania actually criticized some of the other NATO leaders of other countries in NATO, saying they failed to prevent the Russian aggression, and said that this has been something that's been in the news the last few days, that the refusal to invite Ukraine to NATO would be a mistake. Obviously, President Biden said that when the war ends, they can come. But obviously, under Article 5, if Ukraine joined NATO, then all of NATO would be in war with Russia, which is obviously something that we kind of don't want.
Well, something doesn't want either. I mean, for all of the bluster and everything like that, Russia attacking a NATO country would be absolutely insane. I mean, the best way it ends is with nuclear annihilation. And that's the best way for Russia.
Well,
I mean, there really isn't, it's really just not an option. But the Baltic states saw this coming long before the more Western governments did, or admitted they did at least. So it's not surprising that you would hear this coming out of Lithuania.
Is that why, do they kind of really try and get the summit here? Obviously, I mean, the US president's there, UK prime minister, all the leaders of NATO are just miles from the Belarus border in Vilnius right now. Is this kind of like a show to Belarus and Russia of, we're right here?
Yeah, I think for that, and for, the other reasons we've just sort of enumerated, they could not have picked a better place for this. And Vilnius is a great, great city. I love it every time I go there. And I think it's the perfect place to hold this NATO conference right in the middle of this war. And, honestly, given the atmosphere, I'm hoping something more comes out of it for Ukraine.
Well, yeah, over the next 2 days, we'll have to see. Well, where next year's summit's going to be, a place where I just was, Washington, D.C.
All right.
USA.
America.
All right, so kind of just to wrap things up here, we've heard about a bunch of the stuff that's been going on in Ukraine. Obviously, the Prigozhin Rebellion, Sweden, Ukraine wanting to come into NATO. But unless you're following it really closely, I think there's a lot of major events that have happened that haven't really been covered by US media. So what do you think some of those major events that have happened are that we really should know about that a lot of us probably really don't?
There was a lot of coverage of the Russian war crimes early on. And, we seem to have taken our foot on the gas on that one. But these have not stopped. And, I really do wish Western media would pay more attention to it, because it's not something that's ceased. And this is particularly true with the way the Russian government has been abducting Ukrainian children and shipping them off to Russia. And they are not disguising this. I realize that this is why Putin has been indicted in The Hague. But, I think it's something that we should be beating the drum more about, because this really is an atrocity. I mean, you are completely stealing these children and shipping them off to Russia, where at best they can be second-class citizens. And that is at best. We just don't seem to be talking about it that much. That said, there are a lot of interesting things that are going on within the Russian command structure that we don't seem to be hearing too much about lately. We have a little bit, but particularly in the wake of the mutiny, and this is because it's hard for me to get my own information other than from, Ukrainian Russian sources and things like that. But one of Prigozhin's demands when he was doing his little mutiny was, basically he wanted to remove the command structure in the Ministry of Defense. And it seems kind of weird, because for a while, Gerasimov disappeared, and we don't really know what happened to him. He's been doing this periodically when he's been in trouble, but then he just very, very recently reappeared in essentially one of those staged Kremlin videos of him sort of like acting like a commander. Of course, it would all be speculation, trying to figure out what's going on. But what's also interesting about this, and which is probably an even more interesting story, is that at this meeting, Surovikin should have also been in attendance, and he wasn't. And Surovikin has long been associated with Prigozhin. And there's a lot of speculation that he knew about this mutiny and did nothing about it. And he has completely disappeared since. Now, Surovikin was basically in charge of the entire Ukrainian theater for quite a while. This was the General Armageddon or whatever it was in Syria. Surovikin has been completely MIA. There was sort of like a hostage video that he made, saying I'm okay. There was something from his daughter saying he's at work, but nobody's seen him. Given what has happened since to Prigozhin, that he's had this meeting with Putin and that kind of thing, it's really interesting to speculate on what has happened to this guy. This is something we haven't really seen too much of. But again, it's all just speculation. So it might not even be news.
Also, before I ask my final question, I should note that I was looking on here and I found that the leaders of who are attending that NATO summit, you've also got the leaders of Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, and Zelensky is there too. So you've got all these major world leaders those aren't countries in NATO, but they're obviously against Russia, who are right there in Vilnius, which is it's not very far from the border of Belarus if you look at it on the map.
Nope, not at all.
All right, so wrapping it all up here, Dr. Bobby, thanks again for coming on the podcast. But I guess overall question to wrap it up, where is the tide turning right now on this war? What is the sense that it's going on? I think I know the answer to this from what we've been building up to and what we've been talking about, how things aren't going so well in Russia. What is your sense right now on how this is going to play out?
In terms of the initial justification for the war given by Putin, they've already lost.
Ha ha, loser.
They are not going to depose the Nazi regime in Kiev, as they called it.
Oh, that's right.
I mean, that's just not happening. I mean, it would probably take the Russian military at least a decade to build itself up enough to get an attacking force that could take Kiev.
Yeah, if you I'm looking at CNN right now, they have this map of the Russian occupied territories, and it really is just this little strip of land on the eastern edge of Ukraine. Not even anywhere near Kharkiv, certainly not anywhere near Kiev, like not even close in Ukraine. Like the amount of territory that they hold it's obviously they hold territory, but it's, when you look at it, it's not very much.
Yeah. No, it's not. And, given the way, and I probably should have addressed this in your previous question too, I think I meant to. Given the way Ukraine is fighting this counteroffensive, I mean, they are doing it as a kind of war of attrition, not this lightning counteroffensive that everybody was expecting. I mean, they are taking aim at supply depots, ground lines of communications, command centers. They're not going straight at it. The longer they do this, really, the harder this is going to be for Russia to defend themselves. And once those defenses break down, it's probably going to collapse. So not only I think is obviously the original dreams of this war on the part of Russia are now just completely off the table. That's not going to happen. But even holding on to what they have is going to become, I think, within the next several months, not weeks, but months, become increasingly tenuous. I don't think they can hold on to it. I think really probably their best case scenario at this point is to hold on to Crimea. And I'm not entirely sure they're going to be able to do that. I mean, another thing that we haven't really seen so much in the media is the partisan activity that's been going on behind the lines. I mean, there are assassinations, there are car bombings, there's sabotage. I mean, this is not something that doesn't exist. Russia's ability to continually deal with that is going to get weakened as time goes on as well. So, how is the war going to turn out? Who knows? I mean, all kinds of crazy things happen. But I just don't see any scenario where this is positive for Russia at all. They'll be extremely lucky if they can hang on to what they have. I mean, the strip of land they have. I mean, if you look at the map of Moldova and you see Transnistria, this is kind of what they control in Ukraine looks like. It's just this. It's becoming a more and more narrow strip of land. Mm-hmm. They can cut this off in the middle and sort of cut off the ground line to the Crimean Peninsula. I mean, that will probably be the beginning of the end.
And you see they're trying to do that too when they make their advances in Bakhmut, which once you get there, you kind of see the path for them to cut it off right there.
Well, there are several different ways they can go. And Bakhmut is a little bit further north, but once they can sort of get a breakthrough, and this kind of seems to be what they're doing now, is that they're just sort of probing. As they repeat over and over again, we haven't put the full force in. All of the weapons they gained from the West and things like that, they haven't really used them yet. Most of them have been sitting and waiting. Once they figure out where they're going to go, it is really going to get started. But this will probably be, at least another couple of weeks.
Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Bobby, some one-of-a-kind insight from the Baltic States, giving us basically everything, all the facts that we need to know regarding Russia and Ukraine and the war that's going on. That's really important. We may be a continent and an ocean away, but even here to us in the United States, it's extremely important what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. So, Dr. Bobby, once again, thanks for coming on the podcast. Give us all the facts.
You bet, buddy. Anytime.
Zander's Facts.
So there you have it, y'all. Thanks once again to Dr. Bobby for coming on the podcast, giving us the lowdown, breaking down what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine war, because it's really important, I think, and there's a lot of things that we probably should know here in America that the news media really isn't covering, unless you're paying really close attention. So hopefully you learned a lot of facts on this week's podcast. But those are all the facts that I've got for episode 111 of the podcast. Thank you all so much for listening, and remember that if you like the Zander's Facts podcast, if you liked all the facts that you just heard, you should follow this podcast, download this episode 111, to your device, to all your devices, and then you can delete it the next day. I think it still counts, and re-download it the next day. I'll do all that stuff. Rate and review the podcast. Check us out on all the socials, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. By the way, I did say Twitter. We should change that to Threads. Zander's Facts is on Threads at Zander's Facts. You should go check that out. And also, most importantly, you should spread the facts. Zander's Facts podcast. Tell all your friends about the podcast, about the newsletter, about Zander's Facts on YouTube. We publish all our new episodes to YouTube. We just had our most watched, or most viewed at least, episode that we put on YouTube ever.
This is true.
Last week. So you should go subscribe to the Zander's Facts YouTube channel. The link is also in this episode's description. And you should check out the Zander's Facts link tree because it has all the Zander's Facts links that you need. So, as I mentioned earlier, next week is episode 112. We are previewing the Women's World Cup. It's an expanded World Cup, so there's 32 teams now in the Women's World Cup. We're going to give you all the facts you need to know, and of course predict who's going to win this year's edition of Women's Soccer's Brightest Stage. Is it going to be the U.S. for the third time in a row? They begin, by the way, this is coming up pretty soon because next Thursday is the first games. I believe the first game kicks off at 3 a.m. The times aren't going to be great, but the U.S., their first game is against Vietnam, and it's on Friday night at 9 o'clock, which is not too bad. Two of their group games are at 9 o'clock. The other one's at 3 a.m., which is, I'm going to watch it. I'll be up, but, that's rough. So, we've got a big-time, fact-filled preview of the Women's World Cup coming up next week, episode 112 of the podcast. Listen to that. Remind yourself. Put a reminder. Women's World Cup preview podcast, Wednesday. Launches at 5 a.m. Of course, you can listen whenever you want, wherever you want, on YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. So that is it. that is a wrap on episode 111 of the podcast. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see y'all with episode 112 next week.
I just busted right inside him, and he can't extend on me anymore, and he seems a little overwhelmed by my girth and tonnage.